I'm glad you're joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in January of 2022. Today, we're going to be talking about mutual concern for human rights and non-human animal rights, with a provocative discussion about the intersection of immigration, migration, discrimination, the human-animal divide, and speciesism. Our guest is Dr. Natalie Khazaal of Georgia Tech, discussing a book she recently co-edited with Spanish scholar Nuria Almiron called Like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies Perspectives on Borders, Displacement, and Othering. Let me tell you about her. Dr. Natalie Khazaal is an assistant professor in the School of Modern Languages at Georgia Institute of Technology and an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow for her work on Arab atheists. She studies the links among disenfranchisement, media, and language. Dr. Khazaal is the author of the 2018 book, Pretty Liar, Television, Language, and Gender in Wartime Lebanon, which shows how Lebanese people demanded responsive media at times of unrest and deep social divisions. Additionally, among her co-authored publications on critical animal studies are articles on speciesism in the US and Spanish media and EU policy on vivisection, as well as her co-edited volume that shows how we can bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice for human and non-human refugees and migrants. The book is called Like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies Perspectives on Borders, Displacement, and Othering, published by Brill in 2021, and that's the book we'll be discussing today. Dr. Khazaal is on the advisory board of Ideas Beyond Borders, an organization that promotes the free exchange of ideas and defends human rights from extremists and authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. She also served as the founding faculty advisor to the first Texas chapter of No Lost Generation, a student initiative for global refugee and migrant crisis relief efforts. And she was nominated for the Achievements in Climate and Inclusion 2019 award at Texas A&M University for encouraging and facilitating more inclusive and welcoming climate for all. Originally from Bulgaria, Dr. Khazaal earned her PhD from UCLA, teaching at Georgetown and Texas A&M before starting on the faculty at Georgia Tech here in Atlanta. Welcome, Dr. Khazaal.
Thank you for having me, Carrie.
Yeah, I just thought we'd start by a little bit about you. What was it from your experiences in Bulgaria with immigration, or maybe your own immigration, that got you interested in exploring the overlapping narratives of immigration, animalization, and dehumanization?
It was two encounters with two different people, one actually in Bulgaria and the other one in Lebanon. So my grandparents, when they retired, they bought a little house on the Turkish-Bulgarian border, which also their neighbor was one of the principals of a high school. He used to come only in the summers, but then later, after he retired, he actually moved there, and now he still lives there. So the German press actually wrote about him, a whole article, interviewing him and other people, but him as well. And basically in that article, they described him, how he had a really very humanist and humane attitude towards the refugees. Because this is on the border, once the refugee crisis started, a lot of refugees started just crossing there and on foot going through that village. And he was really kind and nice to them. He would give them water, sometimes bread, just help them out.
Right.
And he said, they are humans just like you and me. And so I compared that to another experience I had when I was in Lebanon, when I was doing research there. The person who was not the landlord, but he was kind of the manager of the apartment that I was renting. And we started talking, and he said that he wanted to immigrate to Poland. And long story short, he said it's kind of awful there because of all these refugees that are going to Poland, and they're just just making matters worse for all of us. And he said these animals. And I was shocked to hear, that perspective. And so I started comparing, okay, look, that in the German press got very positive reviews. He was treating them, they're just like you and me. And then this other person talks about them like they're animals. And so that really got me interested in that whole I guess, comparison between different places that were dealing with refugees. In Lebanon, there is a huge, about 2 million Syrian refugees are in Lebanon.
Wow.
And the country is just 4.5 million. So it's like 30% of the people there are refugees.
Wow.
But that was one of the kind of like sparks. And there was another spark. I was teaching a class on these kinds of matters, on minorities, on refugees and whatnot. And then two of the students in the class, because my classes are based on projects, students have to do projects in them. And so two of the students came to me and they said, like, as their project, they wanted to found the first Texas chapter of the No Lost Generation organization, which is the student organization that connects refugee organizations with NGOs, with governments and whatnot for
Nice.
relief efforts. And so when I saw that these students actually were affected by what I was teaching in my class, I said, I mean, oh my goodness, now I have to write the book. And I always tell my students, like, they don't realize, they think that only professors, influence their thinking, but the opposite is just as true. They don't realize how much they themselves inspire us as professors. And, in this case, this is what happened.
Oh, that's awesome. And I know that, like me, you're someone who studies and supports animal rights. Also, we would call it the field critical animal studies. How did your interest in animal protection come about?
Well, my interest in critical animal studies actually it came from just in general supporting animal rights. And I actually, over 30 years ago, I realized, and that happened overnight, I realized that the system was immoral. And, that made a huge impact on my whole life, on like my lifestyle, on my thinking. But then I became more active when I was at UCLA, when I was doing my PhD, and not so much from the schoolwork that I was doing, but one time I saw a flyer for something called Vegan Toastmasters. Toastmasters is an international speech club where you go and then you develop your public speaking skills
Right.
in a supportive environment. And that was like a vegan Toastmasters. At the time I didn't realize what it was. I thought it was just like a one time, they will give us some tips how to speak about veganism. And then when I joined, I saw that it's an organization that, you come there on a weekly or semi-weekly basis. And I loved it. And that was really helpful for me to basically hone in these kind of ideas. And then
Because were you already vegan at the time? And so this is just helping you articulate and express the
correct.
reasons why.
Yes, correct.
Which is great to get you in shape to write a book. So my next question is about your book. In your co-edited book called Like an Animal, one of the goals was to explore how speciesism plays a primary role in questions of refuge, borders, displacement, migration, and dehumanization. And I'm going to have you explain this because when we think of speciesism as upholding oppression of because we tend to think of speciesism just in terms of non-human animals. Like speciesism means we discriminate against other animals as not being morally relevant beings because they're not human. But then how is speciesism also a framework for upholding oppressions against certain humans, in particular human immigrants and refugees?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an excellent question, actually. Speciesism is the framework within which we understand immigration, and not only immigration, but also minorities, all sorts of out groups, so to speak, not like our own group, but like other groups, and refugees for the most part in the US and throughout the world, because basically what happens is people divide groups of humans into those that are really human and those that are not human. And so they dehumanize them. But dehumanization, to deny somebody their, quote unquote, human origins or human roots, means that you have to compare them to something else. And that something else is very negative, and that something else is other animals. And so we can't really have dehumanization without having this universal group that is the most, that lacks any moral consideration, that is basically it could be abused, it could be killed, and exploited without any repercussions. And so when you move a group of humans from what is considered to be, the human, I guess,
like some ideal notion of a human, some privileged notion,
right? Which, you kind of enjoy protection when you have that label. When you move them outside of that label, and that this is what we call the divide between human and non-human. When you move them out, they lose protection just because other animals are not protected. We don't have laws to protect them from, being killed, from being eaten, from being exploited. You don't have these kinds of laws that we have for humans. And so once you move the human, like one human group, from the protected part into the other side of the divide, which is not protected, they're basically open to be exploited, to be mistreated, and whatnot. And I can just give you one example. I mean, during the pandemic, take, for example, the meat industry, the so-called meat industry. So refugees and immigrants are really the backbone of that industry, because the proportion of them working in that industry is higher than in any other U.S. industry, and that's probably true for most of the world. But the fact that they are like so numerous in that industry doesn't give them any protection or any bargaining power. For instance, in the beginning of the pandemic, around May, 90% of all the COVID cases in some counties came from the meatpacking plants like Tyson.
Oh gosh.
And workers there didn't have any PPE, no protection. If they felt sick, like some of them said in the press, they just had to take a Tylenol and keep on working, because if they didn't work, they wouldn't get a paycheck. I don't know if the listeners remember, but Trump banned the meat industry from closing during that part of the pandemic in order to, quote unquote, feed America. And so,
so they had to work in dangerous conditions, and some people died because of it. Yeah,
exactly. And, and also spread the disease even against their will. And at the same time, they're called by the US president animals, they don't enjoy protection. And, if we think of a border as something that, it's no longer a line of this in the sand, but it's like a system of these practices that even the US president, in performances that we can call like the border. And now the border is not just between two countries, but there is an internal border. There is a border between the refugees and between like the rest of the US, right? With the refugees being mistreated in certain ways, being called animals, being called whatnot. And so here you see this dehumanization, at the root of which lies speciesism being turned on against the refugees, against the immigrants, not just the refugees, against, the displaced. And the displaced, these are the second most vulnerable minority in the world. In the meatpacking industry, that very vulnerable minority actually faces the task of killing the world's #1 most vulnerable group, which is non-human animals that are used for food. And so we see that interconnection between speciesism, between the divide between animals and human and non-human animals, and how governments can manipulate the life of refugees, and also refugees can manipulate the life of other animals, and they decide basically who gets to live and who gets to die and be eaten.
Wow, that's so powerful. I think that's analogy is a strong one in terms of the vulnerability of everyone then in the slaughterhouse, maybe except for some of the managers.
Yeah.
But the immigrant workers who are exploited and very vulnerable, and then the non-human animals, whether they be the chickens or the turkeys or the cows or the pigs, who are being killed because they also don't matter, or only matter, in a money-making way. Speaking of divides and borders, I was going to talk about that human-animal divide a little bit more, because in your book, Like an Animal, the book we're discussing, you say one of the book's main critiques is aimed at those who solidify and defend the human-animal divide, because this human animal division ultimately negatively affects both human and non-human animals. Can you explain, as I imagine that like many well-meaning human rights activists struggle to show the humanity of marginalized human groups by claiming they're not animals. But then those well-meaning people are deepening this divide in the hierarchy by kind of saying like, oh, let's keep animals down and bring this group of humans up. Like, and so I don't know. So they're ultimately trying to help humans, but they're maybe not helping animals in the process. I don't know if there's a way that you can help humans and show that that human group matters without denigrating other animals or acting like other animals also don't matter.
This is a very profound question, and you put it in really easy, I think, terms to understand. So you're right. People who defend refugees and immigrants and other minorities struggle really hard because they don't realize the essential meaning of speciesism, or the prejudice against other species, that is used as framework for dehumanization and framework for discrimination and disenfranchisement of human minorities. And it is used as I said, as a framework, but they don't realize it. And instead of getting rid of the whole system, of the whole framework, what they do is they try to, quote unquote, rehumanize these minorities. And this is something that is quite popular these days. We have to rehumanize them. Unfortunately, when you rehumanize them, what you do is, you are shifting what's known as the soft divide. This is the divide between different human groups, different between those that have the protection and those that, like refugees and stuff, may
or
not
by
have
race or class.
right.
Or, yeah.
Uh-huh. So you're shifting that little line, that soft divide, but by shifting it, you are making the hard divide, which is between humans and other species, very, very entrenched. You're making it so deep. And just imagine, this divide is so deep. And at any given moment, any political interest and political will, which has happened throughout history, can just dehumanize them again. They can just shift that line, because the hard divide is always there. It's always there to be misused, and it's always there to basically incorporate yet another new group of humans that are denied their humanity. And so this process becomes this perpetual kind of wheel that is turning and turning. And if you want to stop the wheel, you basically have to completely demolish and destroy the hard divide, not just the soft divide. If you don't have a hard divide, there is nowhere to move a human minority out of protection. There isn't another place.
Right. Like it's because I like to have us embrace our animality, because humans are one animal species among many, but we've given ourselves this exalted moral status. Yeah. Or at least some people we've given this exalted moral status. But if we, in your book tries to get at this, I think, like, if we didn't demonize animality as something to be ashamed of or have it be worthless, that to say that animals' lives don't matter at all, then you can't, that takes away some of the power to put human groups in that animal category. Like if we're not supposed to treat other animals badly, then we can't use that as a continual excuse to dehumanize humans. Right. And so I think that's part of where animal rights and human rights comes together, to say that they can be mutually beneficial, even though I think human rights historically has not seen itself as aligned with animal rights and wants to separate, like you say, to keep that hard divide. But we should actually be questioning that hard divide and like what it would mean for humanity if we started to embrace the fact that we're animals and embrace other animals, like all the good that could be done, not just for other animals, but for us too, and the way we would treat each other.
Yeah, they say humanism is a violent ideology. It's an ideology that is filled with, all these sorts of, militant ideas that project a unique nature of humans. Like humans are the only rational, humans are the only who have language, humans are the only this and the only that. And it turns out on most of these, they're not the only, but having that ideology really has wreaked havoc on not just on human societies and other animals, but on the planet in general.
Definitely. If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature, and I'm host Carrie Freeman talking with Dr. Natalie Khazaal, assistant professor at Georgia Tech, about the book she co-edited with Nuria Almiron called Like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies, Approaches to Borders, Displacement, and Othering. We only have a few minutes left, but I know that in your book, you did a study on the way that newspapers in Bulgaria and Lebanon frame stories on immigration during the Syrian refugee crisis, to kind of bring it back to the beginning where we started. And did you find that that they were using some kind of dehumanizing language or reinforcing that human-animal divide?
Yeah,
Even
absolutely.
journalists maybe not even realizing they're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think a lot of them, probably all of them, never realized that. But they did use many techniques of dehumanization, indirect dehumanization, direct dehumanization when they actually call them animals, and even infrahumanization, which is like you deny them some of these so-called higher level emotions, like creativity and whatnot. But let me give you an example how this happened in the newspapers. One of the, I think, most notorious examples was in Bulgaria, at least. It was somebody called Dinko. So apparently this Dinko from some, little town in the mountain, he made a name out for himself in the media by claiming that he's a refugee hunter. And so just compare the refugee hunter with hunter of other animals, and so he collected a bunch of hooligans like him, and they went out to the borders and tried to patrol the borders and try to capture refugees, and he was the press, the right-wing press, both made him to be a hero, but at the same time they really ridiculed him. For instance, they were saying like he is a provincial, boy who bravely says that he would kill, and just see where they put the word bravely. He doesn't bravely kill. He bravely says that he's going to kill refugees. And he had like all sorts of shenanigans, like he would show off in a tank on the freeway, and, just like stuff like that. So basically that trope, the refugee hunter and the refugee hunt, became one of the most, notorious examples of dehumanization, and also of how speciesism as a framework was used against refugees in this particular case.
Because is it like he's hunting, like he's out in the woods to kill deer or something? Is that kind of the impression you got?
Yes,
from the hunting analogy? Yeah.
Exactly. He's the hunter against, these other animals. But in that case, the other animal species was the refugees, the Syrian refugees.
And I guess in that case, I shouldn't have maybe used deer as an example. It's more of like a predatory animal, because then that's what they're saying, that the refugees are so supposedly dangerous, they deserve to be killed. Like, yes, we also demonize like carnivorous animals or something, and we're scared of them, and a lot of times we don't need to be, but anyway, and then we kill them, whether it's wolves or coyotes or panthers or other animals. So yeah, so I see what you're saying there.
And another example, let me give you from the Lebanese press. There was like multiple people who got outed in the press for instance, one person was inciting his like a 3-year-old or 5-year-old to hit a Syrian refugee, and the press called this man an animal in human form. So again, see how the non-human divide was used here for him to be, basically not part of the human species. And they had like a bunch of other examples, like some of them were refugees themselves. When they were interviewed, they were protesting, we are not animals. or
Right.
chickens even live better than us. And so
Yeah.
here we see how they want to basically really reinstate the deep divide between the hard divide between humans and non-humans, and include themselves within the human category because they feel themselves excluded. And so these kinds of examples were abounding in both the Lebanese and Bulgarian press.
Well, we're out of time, Dr. Khazaal, but I didn't know if there was a book or two that you wanted to just quickly mention in case somebody wanted to read more on the topic of speciesism and dehumanization.
I would very much recommend a book by an author called Melanie Joy, which is called Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. And it's an introduction to carnism, eating meat, and also to speciesism. In terms of dehumanization, there is a book that I would recommend, again, with the caveat that it also includes some dehumanization, but it gives us also a good idea about, includes some speciesism, but it gives us a general overall view of dehumanization. And this book is called Less Than Human. The author is David Livingstone Smith.
Okay, Less Than Human. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Dr. Natalie Khazaal, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. And thanks for the work you do developing critical animal studies within a social justice context.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. We post action items, news, and podcasts of the show's website on the show's website, facebook.com/intune to nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species. Thanks for listening. Cheers.